Flight attendant mocked black teen for flying alone. Next minute, she owns the jet. You know, honey, I think you might be at the wrong gate. Economy boarding is that way. The words hung in the air, dripping with false sweetness and unmistakable condescension. Prejudice in the skies takes a turbulent turn when the wrong person is underestimated. We've all felt that uncomfortable sensation of being judged by a stranger's dismissive glance. But what happens when that judgment comes at 30,000 feet, trapped in a pressurized tube hurling across the Atlantic? For one senior flight attendant, what began as a routine exercise in quiet discrimination spirals into a career-ending catastrophe within the span of a single transatlantic flight. She sizes up a young black teenager in worn jeans and a simple hoodie, decides she doesn't belong in first class, and proceeds to mock, belittle, and ultimately threaten her. But she makes one critical error. She has no idea who she's talking to. In the next few minutes, the power dynamic won't just shift, it will shatter. This isn't just a story about karma or consequences. It's about what happens when you push the wrong person too far, when prejudice blinds you to reality, when assumptions lead to a catastrophic fall. What would you do if someone tried to humiliate you in front of a plane full of strangers? And what if you suddenly had the power to change everything with a single phone call? The Skylight first-class lounge at JFK Terminal 4 was a hushed sanctuary of muted colors and quiet efficiency. Here, the clinking of ice in crystal tumblers was the loudest sound, a gentle percussion against the backdrop of murmured conversations about market caps and weekend trips to the Hamptons. It was a world designed to insulate, to soothe the frayed nerves of the global elite before they were sealed into a pressurized tube and hurled across the Atlantic. Into this serene bubble walked Jade Thomas. At 17, she was a study in contrast to her surroundings. She wasn't draped in Prada or carrying a Hermes bag. Instead, she wore a simple dark gray hoodie from her high school's robotics club, a pair of worn-in jeans, and well-loved Nike sneakers. Her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and the only accessory she wore was a pair of high-tech Bose headphones around her neck. She carried a single scuffed backpack that looked heavy with textbooks and a laptop. To the casual observer, she looked like a student who had perhaps wandered into the wrong area, a lost lamb in a den of silver-haired lions. But there was something in her posture, in the quiet confidence of her gaze, that suggested she knew exactly where she belonged. She presented her ticket at the front desk. The agent, a polished man in his late 20s, scanned it without a second glance. "Welcome, Miss Thomas. Your flight to Geneva Transatlantic 847 is on time. Boarding for first class will begin in approximately 45 minutes from gate B7. Please make yourself comfortable." Jade gave a small, polite smile. "Thank you." She found an empty leather armchair in a corner, slid her heavy backpack onto the floor, and pulled out a worn paperback on quantum computing. She was on her way to an international STEM competition in Switzerland, the culmination of a year's hard work. Her team had developed an algorithm that could potentially revolutionize the way quantum computers handle complex medical simulations. The implications for disease research were enormous. She was nervous, excited, and completely focused on the complex equations in her book. Tomorrow, she would be presenting their findings to some of the brightest minds in the field. The weight of that responsibility pressed against her chest, making her breath come a little quicker. She'd been chosen as lead presenter because of her extraordinary ability to explain complex concepts in accessible terms. "You make quantum seem simple," her physics teacher had said. Jade turned a page, making a small notation in the margin. A freshman at Stanford had recently published a paper challenging one of the core assumptions in her team's research. She was formulating a response, a way to incorporate his critique while strengthening their overall thesis. She was so absorbed in fact that she didn't notice the pair of eyes that had been tracking her since she sat down. The eyes belonged to Victoria Palmer. Victoria was a senior flight attendant with Transatlantic Airways, a 22-year veteran of the skies. She carried herself with an air of rigid authority that came from decades of managing unruly passengers and enforcing federal aviation regulations. With her blonde hair pulled into a severe immaculate bun, her uniform pressed to a razor's edge, and her makeup flawlessly applied, she was the very picture of control. But beneath that polished veneer, a bitter resentment had taken root over the years. She served the world's wealthiest people smiling as she poured their champagne and fluffed their pillows, all while drowning in credit card debt and struggling with a mortgage she could barely afford. Her ex-husband had left her for a younger woman 3 years ago, and her son's college tuition was coming due. The unfairness of it all, of serving people who had never known a moment's financial anxiety, had curdled something inside her. She saw Jade, and her mind, a well-oiled machine of snap judgments, immediately categorized her. Charity case, it sneered. Or maybe one of those influencer kids whose 15 minutes are already ticking down. The airline probably gave her a publicity seat. Victoria took a sip of her lukewarm coffee, and a wave of indignation washed over her. First class was supposed to be exclusive. It was a privilege, one that this girl in her cheap hoodie clearly didn't understand or deserve. It diluted the brand. It cheapened the experience for the real first-class passengers. Victoria watched as Jade, completely oblivious, got up to get a bottle of water from the complimentary fridge. She walked with a quiet confidence that irritated Victoria even more. It wasn't the boisterous look-at-me entitlement of the newly rich, but something deeper, calmer. It was the confidence of someone who simply believed she belonged wherever she was. And Victoria Palmer had decided right then and there that Jade Thomas didn't belong here. She made a mental note, seat 2A. She would be working the first-class cabin on TA 847. This, she thought, with a thin, predatory smile, could be interesting. The storm was gathering, and its unsuspecting eye was a 17-year-old girl reading a book about quantum physics. The Skylight Lounge was a carefully orchestrated theater of wealth and privilege. The lighting was soft enough to flatter aging skin, but bright enough to read financial reports. The carpets were plush, absorbing the sound of expensive footsteps and hushed deal-making. The air smelled faintly of citrus and sandalwood, a signature scent created exclusively for transatlantic airways by a French perfumer. In one corner, a silver-haired man in a bespoke suit tapped at his laptop, occasionally murmuring into a Bluetooth earpiece in German. Nearby, a couple in matching cashmere loungewear sipped champagne at 10:30 in the morning, their matching Rolex watches glinting under the recessed lighting. A woman with a perfect blonde bob flipped through Architectural Digest, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light with every turn of the page. This was a different species of traveler than those cramped in the general terminal. These people didn't worry about baggage fees or middle seats. They worried about whether their chauffeurs would be waiting in Geneva, whether their hotel suites would have the right view of the lake. Victoria Palmer understood these people. After 22 years in first class, she knew their habits, their expectations, their little tells. She could distinguish old money from new at 20 paces. The old money wore well-made clothes with discreet labels. The new money wore logos like battle armor. The old money tipped quietly and exactly. The new money made a show of generosity or didn't tip at all. Victoria had once dreamed of being one of them. She'd become a flight attendant at 26, seduced by the promise of glamour and travel. The reality had been different. Grueling hours entitled passengers and a salary that never quite kept pace with inflation. Over time, her dreams had curdled into resentment. She'd never be one of them. But she could control their comfort, their experience. It was a small power, but she'd learned to wield it precisely. Now, watching Jade read her book on quantum computing, Victoria felt a familiar irritation rise within her. The girl clearly didn't fit the profile. Her hoodie was from a public high school. Her sneakers were scuffed at the edges. Yet here she was in the inner sanctum of privilege, acting as if she belonged. Victoria noted with satisfaction that none of the regular passengers had acknowledged the girl. They had their own finely tuned radars for who belonged and who didn't. Their practiced indifference was its own form of rejection. "Excuse me," a voice said, breaking Victoria's concentration. She turned to find Carlos Rodriguez, the gate agent. Carlos was in his early 30s with warm brown eyes and a perpetually friendly demeanor that Victoria found exhausting. "We're expecting a full first-class cabin today," he said, handing her the passenger manifest. 16 passengers, including one minor, traveling alone. Victoria took the tablet, scrolling through the names. Her finger stopped at Seat 2A, Thomas Jade. "A minor in first?" she asked, keeping her voice professionally neutral. Carlos nodded. "Yep. Ticket was purchased normally. All documentation is in order. She's 17, so no unaccompanied minor procedures needed." "Did you see who dropped her off?" Victoria asked, trying to sound casual. "Parent guardian." Carlos shook his head. "No idea. I just processed the paperwork." He paused, then added, "She seems pretty self-sufficient. Polite, too." Victoria handed the tablet back with a tight smile. "Thanks for the heads up." As Carlos walked away, Victoria took another look at Jade, who was now making notes in the margins of her book. Something didn't add up. A 17-year-old traveling alone in first class, dressed like she'd just come from a public school, reading a book on quantum computing. It had to be a mistake, or worse, a scam. There were stories circulating among crew about sophisticated ticket fraud people using stolen credit cards or manipulating the booking system. It wouldn't be the first time someone had tried to sneak their way into first class. Victoria pulled out her phone and discreetly took a picture of Jade. She sent it to her colleague Diane, who would be working economy on the same flight. "Keep an eye on 2A when she boards. Something feels off." Diane's response came quickly. "Will do. Ticket fraud." Victoria typed back. "Maybe. Just watch her." She put her phone away and straightened her uniform jacket. She had 20 minutes before she needed to be at the gate for pre-boarding. 20 minutes to observe the anomaly in Seat 2A. Across the lounge, Jade remained absorbed in her book, unaware that she was being scrutinized, unaware that in the mind of Victoria Palmer, she had already been tried and found wanting. Unaware that a simple flight to a science competition was about to become something far more complicated. An older man sitting nearby glanced at Jade's book, his eyebrows rising slightly in interest. Unlike Victoria, his reaction was one of curiosity rather than suspicion. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to being heard in courtrooms. "Is that Dawson's quantum computing theoretical approaches?" Jade looked up, momentarily surprised by the interruption. "Yes, it is." "You're familiar with it?" "My wife was a physicist at Columbia for 30 years, he replied with a small smile. "Some of it rubbed off on me." "Jackson Williams," he added, extending his hand. "Jade Thomas," she responded, shaking his hand. "Your wife's work. What was her specialty?" "Quantum coherence," he said. She would have loved to see the progress being made in applying quantum theory to practical computing problems. They chatted briefly about recent developments in the field, Judge Williams, asking thoughtful questions that revealed his layman's but genuine interest in the subject. Victoria watched this interaction from across the lounge, her irritation deepening. The distinguished-looking man was treating this teenager as an intellectual equal, another data point that didn't fit Victoria's narrative. Their conversation ended as the boarding announcement for Transatlantic 847 echoed through the lounge. Judge Williams nodded politely to Jade before gathering his belongings. "Perhaps we'll continue our discussion on the flight. I believe I'm in 4C. "I'd like that," Jade replied, slipping her book into her backpack. Victoria stood smoothing her uniform as she prepared to head to the gate. This unexpected interaction had only strengthened her resolve to keep a close eye on the girl in 2A. Something still felt off, and Victoria Palmer prided herself on her instincts about passengers. In 22 years, she had developed what she considered an infallible sense for who belonged in first class and who didn't. And Jade Thomas, in Victoria's judgment, definitely didn't belong. The boarding call for Transatlantic 847 echoed through the lounge. Jade packed her book, shouldered her backpack, and made her way to the gate. She joined the short priority queue, standing behind a man in a tailored Italian suit who was loudly closing a deal on his phone. When she reached the gate agent, she handed over her passport and boarding pass. Carlos smiled in recognition. "All set, Miss Thomas. Have a great flight." As the scanner beeped its approval, a sharp feminine voice cut through the air. "Just a moment." Victoria Palmer had positioned herself near the gate ostensibly to greet the premium passengers. She glided over, her smile as bright and artificial as the cabin lighting. She addressed Carlos, but her eyes were locked on Jade. "There might be a problem with this seat assignment," Victoria said, her voice laced with a saccharine sweetness that failed to mask its condescending tone. "We've had some computer glitches today. I wouldn't want this young lady to get settled in the wrong cabin." Carlos looked confused. "The system shows everything is in order. Miss Thomas, seat 2A. Victoria held her gaze on Jade. "Honey, are you sure this is your ticket? Were you traveling with a parent? Sometimes they get separated in the system." Jade met her eyes, a flicker of surprise giving way to a calm, steady focus. "No, I'm traveling alone. The ticket is correct." Her voice was even betraying no agitation. This wasn't the first time she'd encountered this sort of subtle questioning, the implied suggestion that she didn't belong. Victoria's smile tightened. "Of course. Well, welcome aboard. Just double-checking." She gestured grandly toward the jet bridge, a queen granting entry to her court. Jade walked down the jet bridge, the encounter leaving a sour taste in her mouth. She'd dealt with prejudice before, the subtle and the overt. She recognized the look in Victoria's eyes. It was the look of someone who had already written a story about her and was now determined to make her play the part. Behind her, Victoria turned to Carlos. "I'm going to keep an eye on her. Make sure everything is legitimate." Carlos frowned slightly. Her ticket and passport checked out. The system would have flagged any issues. "Systems can be manipulated," Victoria replied. "I've seen it before." Carlos didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue further. He had more passengers to process, and Victoria was his senior. "I've seen people jump on tickets that aren't theirs before," Victoria added, seeing his skepticism. "Just last month we had that TikTok prankster trying to sneak into first with a photoshopped boarding pass." Carlos nodded reluctantly, now slightly less sure of his position. Victoria's subtle reference to a previous incident, whether real or invented, had planted just enough doubt to give her leeway. As Victoria turned to continue boarding passengers, she nearly collided with Judge Williams, who had been standing close enough to overhear the exchange. "Quite thorough in your verification process, aren't you?" he said mildly, presenting his own boarding pass. Victoria's professional smile returned instantly. "Safety and security are our top priorities, sir." "Indeed," he replied, holding her gaze a moment longer than was comfortable. "Though I've found assumptions are often the greatest threat to both." Before Victoria could respond, he moved past her onto the jet bridge, leaving her with the uncomfortable sensation of having been seen through. Victoria boarded the aircraft a few minutes later. As she stepped into the first-class cabin, she immediately spotted Jade in seat 2A, a luxurious pod with its own lie-flat bed, large entertainment screen, and a small minibar. It was more space than most New York apartments. The ticket for that seat alone probably cost more than $15,000. Victoria's suspicions hardened into certainty. There was simply no way this teenager had legitimately purchased this ticket. It had to be fraud or some kind of mistake, or perhaps a last-minute upgrade due to overbooking. She watched as Michael Taylor, the other first-class attendant, approached Jade with a warm smile. Michael was 35 with kind eyes and an easy manner that made him popular with passengers. He had only been with Transatlantic for 5 years, having joined after a career in hospitality. "Welcome aboard, Miss Thomas. Can I get you a pre-departure beverage? Perhaps some juice or water?" "Water would be great. Thank you," Jade replied. As Michael moved away to fetch her drink, Dr. Amelia Fraser settled into seat 3A directly behind Jade. Dr. Fraser, a distinguished cardiac surgeon in her mid-50s, was a regular on this route, traveling frequently for international medical conferences. She nodded politely to Jade, who returned the gesture with a small smile. Across the aisle, Diego Hernandez, a 40-year-old tech executive, was arranging his laptop and documents in the storage compartment of his seat. He glanced over at Jade, noting her robotics club hoodie with professional interest. "MIT Robotics?" he asked, gesturing to her sweatshirt. Jade shook her head. "No, it's from my high school, but MIT is definitely on my wish list." "They'd be lucky to have you," Diego said with a friendly smile before returning to his preparations. Victoria observed these interactions with mounting irritation. The girl was infiltrating their world, making small talk with legitimate first-class passengers as if she belonged among them. As other passengers filed in, Judge Williams, taking his seat in 4C, a Swiss couple, a British financier, Victoria, intercepted Michael as he returned with Jade's water. "I'll take that," she said, her tone making it clear this wasn't a request. "I'll be handling the front section today." Michael raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "Sure, Victoria. Mr. Hernandez in 2D usually prefers the Pellegrino, by the way." Victoria nodded dismissively and approached Jade, setting the water down without a word. She then turned to Diego with a warm smile. "Mr. Hernandez, welcome back. Would you prefer the sparkling water instead?" Diego glanced at Victoria, then at Jade, noting the difference in treatment. "No, still water is fine, thank you." Victoria's smile faltered slightly before she recovered. "Of course. And how is your family? Is your wife joining you in Geneva this trip?" "Not this time," Diego replied, his tone cooler than before. In seat 3A, Dr. Fraser observed the interaction with a slight frown. Having flown first class for years, she was finely attuned to the subtle dynamics of cabin service. Victoria's behavior toward the young woman in 2A struck her as oddly pointed. From behind Dr. Fraser, a quiet voice spoke. First time flying transatlantic, Dr. Fraser turned to find Judge Williams looking at her with a knowing expression. "No, I fly this route monthly for conferences," she replied. "You often enough to recognize when someone is being singled out," he said softly, inclining his head subtly toward the interaction between Victoria and Jade. Dr. Fraser nodded almost imperceptibly. "I was thinking the same thing. Interesting, isn't it?" Williams continued, keeping his voice low. "How quickly some people form judgments based on appearance." "Very," Fraser agreed, "and how willing they are to act on those judgments." Their quiet exchange was interrupted as Victoria moved through the cabin, offering newspapers and welcoming other passengers by name. Her manner with them was markedly different. Warm, solicitous, personalized, creating a stark contrast with her cold treatment of Jade. Jade, meanwhile, had retreated into her quantum computing book, seemingly absorbed in the complex equations. But a subtle tension in her shoulders betrayed her awareness of Victoria's treatment. She had experienced this before, the subtle ways people communicated that she didn't belong in certain spaces. Usually, she let it wash over her, focusing instead on the task at hand. But trapped in a metal tube for the next 7 hours with someone who had clearly decided to make her uncomfortable, that would be more challenging. As the aircraft doors closed and the safety demonstration began, Jade couldn't help but wonder if this would be the extent of it. Subtle discourtesy, cold service, or if Victoria Palmer had more in store for her during the long flight to Geneva. An older woman across the aisle, noticing Victoria's treatment of Jade, caught the teenager's eye and gave her a small smile of solidarity. It was a tiny gesture, but it reminded Jade that not everyone saw the world through Victoria's narrow lens. With that small comfort, she turned back to her book, preparing herself for whatever the flight might bring. Transatlantic Flight 847 climbed steadily through the cloud layer, leaving the Manhattan skyline behind. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner was a marvel of modern luxury. 16 individual pods were arranged in a 1-2-1 configuration, each offering direct aisle access and complete privacy when desired. The lighting was designed to mimic natural circadian rhythms, helping passengers adjust to the time zone changes. The air was filtered through a special system that maintained optimal humidity and removed 99.97% of airborne particles. For most passengers, this environment represented the pinnacle of air travel, a cocoon of comfort that made the 7-hour journey to Geneva feel almost civilized. For Jade Thomas, it was quickly becoming an exercise in maintaining dignity under subtle assault. Once the seatbelt sign was turned off, the meal service began. Victoria moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, her manner warm and attentive except when she reached seat 2A. There, her demeanor underwent a subtle but unmistakable shift. Now she began her tone that of a teacher addressing a slow student. "Our menu tonight is quite sophisticated. It can be a little overwhelming for someone who isn't used to fine dining." She handed Jade the leather-bound menu with 2 fingers, as if reluctant to make contact. "The chef's selection is the pan-seared halibut with a saffron risotto, or if that's too adventurous, we do have a simple chicken breast available." Jade looked at the menu, her expression neutral despite the condescension. "I'll have the filet mignon medium rare with the truffle mac and cheese, please." Victoria's perfectly plucked eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. She typed it into her tablet with a series of sharp, deliberate taps. "An excellent choice," she said, the words stripped of any genuine approval. In seat 2D, Diego Hernandez had observed the interaction while pretending to review documents on his tablet. He caught Jade's eye briefly and gave her a small nod of solidarity. The charade continued throughout the meal service. Jade's water glass remained empty just a minute longer than anyone else's. Her bread roll was cold, while others received warm ones. When she asked for a blanket, Victoria brought one that was still in its plastic wrapper and practically tossed it at her, saying, "Here you go. Try not to make a mess." The other passengers were beginning to notice. Dr. Fraser exchanged a glance with Judge Williams, who shook his head slightly in disapproval. Michael Taylor looked increasingly uncomfortable, trying to compensate by being extra attentive to Jade when Victoria's back was turned. A young woman in her 20s sitting in 1B had been watching the interactions with growing discomfort. Nicole Parker, a marketing executive for a tech company, finally spoke up when Victoria was collecting Jade's barely touched appetizer. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I think she was still working on that." Victoria's smile tightened. "My apologies. I assumed she was finished since she hadn't touched it in some time." "I was just reading," Jade said mildly. "But it's fine, I was done." Nicole frowned but didn't press further. As Victoria moved away, Nicole leaned across the aisle. "Is she always like that with you?" Jade gave a small shrug. "It's not a big deal. I'm used to it." "Well, you shouldn't have to be," Nicole replied firmly. "That's not okay." This brief exchange didn't go unnoticed by Victoria, who saw it as further evidence of the girl disrupting her carefully managed cabin. This teenager wasn't just taking up space where she didn't belong. She was now turning other passengers against her. During a lull in the service, Michael approached Victoria in the galley. "Is everything okay?" he asked quietly. "You seem to be having an issue with the passenger in 2A." Victoria stiffened. "I'm watching a potential security concern." Security concern. Michael's confusion was genuine. "She's a teenager reading a quantum physics book. You don't find it suspicious? A minor traveling alone in first class, wearing clothes from a public high school." Michael stared at her. "No, I don't. Her ticket is valid. She's been nothing but polite." Victoria's voice dropped to a whisper. "I've been doing this job for 22 years. I know when something isn't right. That seat costs more than some people make in 6 months. She's either traveling on someone else's ticket or it's fraud. That's a serious accusation, Victoria. Maybe she's just a bright kid from a well-off family. Victoria scoffed. Look at her. Does she look like she comes from money? The implication hung in the air between them. Michael's expression hardened. I need to check on Mr. Williams, he said, turning away from her. As Michael walked back into the cabin, he caught Dr. Fraser's eye. The surgeon beckoned him closer with a discreet gesture. Is everything all right with the senior attendant? She asked, keeping her voice low. Her behavior toward the young woman in 2A seems targeted. Michael hesitated, professional discretion warring with his obvious discomfort. I'm sorry if the service has been uneven, Dr. Fraser. I'll make sure everyone receives the same standard of care. Dr. Fraser nodded, understanding the delicate position he was in. I'm sure you will, Michael. Thank you. Meanwhile, Judge Williams had been observing the situation with increasing concern. Having spent decades on the bench, he was adept at reading people and situations. What he was witnessing wasn't merely poor service, it was a pattern of deliberate microaggressions. As a black man who had risen through the ranks of a predominantly white legal system, he recognized the signs all too well. I've seen this movie before, he murmured to Dr. Fraser. As have I, she replied quietly. Though usually in hospital boardrooms, not aircraft. One would think that in 2025 we'd have moved beyond this. Williams said, his tone resigned. One would think Fraser agreed, and yet they both watched as Victoria returned to the cabin, making a show of checking on each passenger, asking the Swiss couple if they needed anything, chatting amiably with the British financier about London restaurants, ensuring Judge Williams had the correct vintage of wine. When she reached Jade, her manner changed again. Finished, she asked curtly, gesturing to the remains of Jade's meal. Yes, thank you, Jade replied, her voice steady. Victoria removed the tray with a brisk efficiency that bordered on rudeness. As she turned away, Judge Williams called out, Excuse me, Ms. Palmer. Victoria turned her professional smile immediately back in place. Yes, Judge Williams. Can I get you anything? I couldn't help but notice that my young neighbor here has an empty water glass. Perhaps you could refill it when you have a moment. The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable. Victoria's smile froze for a split second before she nodded. Of course, right away. She returned with a fresh glass of water for Jade, placing it on her tray table without meeting her eyes. Thank you, Jade said. Just doing my job, Victoria replied, the words clipped and cold. As she walked away, Diego Hernandez caught her arm gently. I'd like to speak to the purser, he said, his voice low but firm. Victoria's eyes widened slightly. I am the purser on this flight, Mr. Hernandez. Is there an issue I can address? Diego glanced meaningfully toward Jade, then back to Victoria. I think there might be. Perhaps we could speak privately. Victoria's smile became brittle. Of course, after I finish the service rounds. She moved quickly back to the galley, her mind racing. The situation was slipping out of her control. Passengers were noticing questioning. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The girl was supposed to be intimidated, isolated. Instead, she was gaining allies. Victoria needed to reassert control. She needed to make a definitive statement about who belonged in first class and who didn't. And she needed to do it soon before the mounting criticism from other passengers undermined her authority completely. The opportunity would present itself sooner than she expected. Jade stared out the window at the endless expanse of clouds, their tops gilded by the setting sun. The beauty of the scene contrasted sharply with the ugliness she had experienced inside the cabin. She thought about texting her father but decided against it. He had enough on his plate with the merger negotiations, and what would she say anyway? A flight attendant is being mean to me. It sounded childish even in her own mind. Instead, she closed her eyes and recalled a conversation they'd had last summer sitting on the deck of their lake house in Vermont. Dad, she had asked, watching a pair of eagles circle high above the water. Do you ever get tired of proving yourself? Jonathan Thomas had looked at his daughter, understanding immediately what she was asking. At 45, he was one of the most successful tech entrepreneurs in the country, the founder of Quantum Nexus Technologies, a company that had revolutionized satellite communications and computing infrastructure. Yet he still encountered boardrooms where he was the only black face, still endured subtle questions about his credentials, still saw surprise in people's eyes when they learned who he was. It's not about proving yourself to them, Jade. He'd said, his deep voice thoughtful. It's about knowing yourself so well that their doubt can't touch you. But it does touch me, she'd admitted. When people look at me like I don't belong in advanced physics, or when they assume I got into Stanford because of diversity quotas rather than my GPA. He had nodded, his eyes sad but resolute. I know, sweetheart, and it's not fair. But here's what I've learned. Dignity isn't negotiable. It's not something others can give or take away. It's something you carry inside you. How do you not get angry? Oh, I get angry. He'd laughed, the sound warm and genuine. But I choose when and how to show it. Anger is like fire. It can warm your house or burn it down. The trick is controlling the burn. So, what do you do when people try to make you feel small? He had looked at her, his expression serious. I remember who I am. Not just my achievements or my bank account, but my character. And then I make a decision about whether this is a battle worth fighting or a person worth educating. And if it is, then you stand your ground. Not with shouting or threats, but with the quiet certainty that you belong wherever you decide to be. Power isn't about dominating others, Jade. It's about refusing to let others dominate you. He had paused, then added, but there are times when you need to draw a clear line. When someone is deliberately trying to humiliate you to strip away your dignity, you don't turn the other cheek. You establish a boundary firmly and without apology. A more recent conversation flickered through her mind, one they'd had just after she was accepted to Stanford's pre-college program. You know, people will question whether you earned it, her father had said, helping her pack for the summer session. I know, she'd replied, folding a robotics team t-shirt. They always do, and it will hurt every time, he acknowledged. That's the part no one tells you, it never stops hurting. She'd looked up, surprised by his candor. So how do you deal with it? You remember that their doubt says more about them than it does about you, he'd said. And then you do what you've always done, you excel anyway. He'd sat beside her on the bed, taking her hand in his. But I want you to know something important, Jade. While I'll always encourage you to fight your own battles, there are moments when it's okay to call for backup. When someone is deliberately trying to humiliate you to make you feel less than human, you call me. Immediately. Dad, I can handle. I know you can. He'd interrupted gently. But you shouldn't have to, not alone. That's what family is for. We stand together against those who would diminish any one of us. The memory faded as Jade opened her eyes, returning to the reality of the first-class cabin and Victoria Palmer's thinly veiled hostility. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Dignity isn't negotiable. She had been patient. She had been polite. She had ignored the slights and maintained her composure. But Victoria wasn't backing down. If anything, her behavior was escalating, becoming more obvious, more deliberate. Jade realized she might need to draw that line her father had spoken about. The question was how and when. Across the aisle, Diego Hernandez watched the young woman with quiet admiration. As a Latino who had climbed the corporate ladder at one of Silicon Valley's most competitive firms, he recognized the particular strain of maintaining composure in the face of prejudice. He had experienced similar treatment earlier in his career. The assumptions, the subtle exclusions, the need to be twice as good just to be considered equal. What bothered him most about the current situation was the flight attendant's blatant targeting of someone who was essentially still a child. Jade couldn't be more than 17 or 18, Yet Victoria was treating her with a hostility that would be inappropriate even toward an adult. His thoughts were interrupted by Michael, who leaned down to speak quietly. "Sir, I wanted to apologize for any tension you might be observing. If there's anything specific I can do to improve your flight experience, please let me know." Diego appreciated the younger flight attendant's attempt to smooth things over, but they both knew he wasn't the one being poorly served. "Thank you, Michael. I'm fine, but I think we both know who might need your attention more." Michael's expression was pained. "I'm doing my best, sir. It's a delicate situation. I understand. Just know that several of us are aware of what's happening." Michael nodded his relief at having allies evident. "Thank you, sir. I'll continue to monitor the situation." As Michael moved away, Judge Williams leaned forward from his seat to address Dr. Fraser. "Reminds me of a case I presided over years ago," he said quietly. "Racial discrimination suit against an airline. Flight attendant repeatedly denied service to a black executive, claimed she thought he was in the wrong seat. Airline settled for a substantial sum once the pattern of behavior was established." Dr. Fraser nodded thoughtfully. "I've been documenting the incidents," she said, indicating her tablet. "Professional habit from hospital work. Date-time specific action. Observable impact." Judge Williams smiled approvingly. "Smart woman. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, but evidence matters." In a flash of professional solidarity, Dr. Fraser showed him her screen, a neatly organized table with timestamps and brief descriptions of each interaction between Victoria and Jade. The entries were clinical objective, the work of someone accustomed to documenting problematic behavior in professional settings. 8:32 p.m. Flight attendant VP delivers meal options to passenger JT with visibly different tone than used with other passengers. 8:40 p.m. VP delivers cold bread roll to JT while other passengers receive warm rolls. 8:55 p.m. VP ignores JT's empty water glass while refilling all others in section. 9:10 p.m. VP delivers blanket to JT still in plastic wrap, tosses it rather than hands. It makes comment about not making a mess. Judge Williams nodded appreciatively. "Thorough and specific. If this escalates, that documentation could be crucial." The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had taken on a strange tension, a collective awareness that something was wrong, combined with the peculiar social paralysis that often accompanies public instances of prejudice. Most passengers were pretending not to notice while simultaneously watching carefully. A few, like Dr. Fraser, Judge Williams, and Diego Hernandez, had moved beyond observation to quiet alliance. And at the center of it all, Jade Thomas sat reading her book on quantum computing, outwardly calm, but inwardly preparing for whatever might come next. She briefly considered using the aircraft's Wi-Fi to text her father just to let him know what was happening, but something held her back. Part of it was pride. She'd handled prejudice before and could handle it again. Part of it was practicality. What could he do from the ground while she was at 37,000 feet? And part of it was a growing determination to see this through on her own terms, to establish that boundary her father had spoken about firmly and without apology. What she didn't realize was how quickly that opportunity would present itself and how dramatically it would change everything. 2 hours into the flight, somewhere over the vast, dark expanse of the Atlantic, Jade finished reviewing her presentation notes. Her eyes were tired from the strain of reading complex equations in the cabin's dim lighting. She decided to recline her seat into its lie-flat position and rest for a while before the next meal service. She pressed the button on her armrest, expecting the seat to smoothly transform into a bed. Instead, it made a slight mechanical whir but remained upright. She tried again, pressing more firmly. The seat shifted slightly, then stopped at a half-reclined position. After a few gentle tries, Jade pressed the call button. Michael was there in seconds. "Is everything all right, Miss Thomas?" "Hi, Michael. My seat seems to be stuck. I can't get it to recline fully," she explained quietly. "Let me take a look," he said, kneeling down. "Sometimes the mechanism can be a bit finicky." He examined the controls, pressing a few buttons in sequence. You're right. It seems to be jammed. Let me try the manual override." Just as he was reaching for the override panel beneath the armrest, Victoria materialized as if she had been waiting for this moment. "What seems to be the problem here?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Just a small issue with the seat, Victoria." "I think I can fix it," Michael said, trying to de-escalate a situation that hadn't even started. Victoria shot him a withering glare before turning her full venomous attention to Jade. "You probably broke it," she said, her voice low but carrying in the quiet cabin. "These pods are very sensitive. You have to know how to operate them properly. They aren't toys." The accusation was so absurd, so blatantly hostile that it stunned the nearby passengers into silence. Dr. Fraser lowered her tablet. Diego Hernandez stopped typing mid-email. Judge Williams' expression darkened. Nicole Parker in 1B, who had been half asleep, sat up straight, suddenly alert. "Excuse me," she said, her tone incredulous. "Did you just accuse her of breaking the seat?" Victoria's head snapped toward Nicole. "I'm simply stating that these seats are complex mechanisms that require proper handling." I pressed the button marked Recline. Jade said, her voice steady despite the public confrontation. "I'm fairly certain that's the correct procedure. Are you suggesting I'm incapable of operating a button?" "I'm suggesting," Victoria hissed, leaning closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow more insulting than a shout, "that you're in a place you don't belong and your presence here is a disruption. I've been checking the passenger manifest. I've cross-referenced everything. There is simply no way a teenager on their own legitimately purchased a $16,000 ticket. It's a fraudulent booking or a computer error, and I am going to correct it." This was it, the ultimate escalation. It was no longer about bad service. It was a direct accusation of fraud. Michael stood up, his face pale. "Victoria, that's completely out of line. You can't accuse a passenger of that." "Stay out of this, Michael," she snapped. "I'm the senior attendant here. I'm in charge." She turned back to Jade, her face a mask of smug triumph. "Now I'm going to give you two options. You can quietly gather your things and I will find you a seat in economy. We'll pretend this was all a simple misunderstanding. Or I can have the captain radio ahead and you can be met by security upon landing in Geneva to explain how you obtained this ticket. Your choice." The cabin was dead silent. Every eye was on Jade. They saw a young girl alone being cornered by a woman in a position of authority. They expected tears or shouting or terrified compliance. They got none of these. Jade held Victoria's gaze for a long moment. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out her smartphone. Victoria scoffed. "Oh, who are you calling?" "Your mommy." "It's a little late for that, don't you think?" Dr. Fraser began to rise from her seat, prepared to intervene, but Judge Williams gently touched her arm, shaking his head slightly. He had been watching Jade throughout the flight and recognized the calm determination in her eyes. This young woman, he sensed, was about to handle the situation in her own way. Jade ignored Victoria's taunt. She swiped through her contacts and pressed a name. As she did, she activated the plane's Wi-Fi calling feature, a premium service her father's company had ironically helped develop. The call connected almost instantly. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice perfectly level. "Sorry to bother you. I'm having a bit of a problem on my flight." She listened for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Yes, transatlantic 847 to Geneva. There's a flight attendant. Her name is Victoria Palmer, who is accusing me of ticket fraud and is threatening to have me arrested." She paused again, nodding slightly. "Okay. No, I'm fine. She's right here." She held the phone out toward Victoria. "My father would like to speak with you." Victoria Palmer looked at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, but her arrogance quickly reasserted itself. Who could this girl's father possibly be? Some mid-level manager who would shout a bit and then back down. She snatched the phone from Jade's hand. "This is Victoria Palmer, Senior Flight Purser," she said, her voice dripping with officious self-importance. "To whom am I speaking?" She listened. The smug expression on her face began to waver. It slowly melted, replaced by confusion, then disbelief, and then finally by the dawning gut-wrenching horror of pure, unadulterated terror. Her face went white, then a sickly shade of gray. The hand holding the phone began to tremble visibly. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I understand, sir." "No, sir." "Of course." "Right away, sir." She handed the phone back to Jade, her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. She stared at Jade not as a misplaced teenager, but as if she were looking at an avenging angel. She had just crossed a line she never even knew existed, and she was about to fall into the abyss. Diego Hernandez, watching this transformation, found himself both fascinated and disturbed. He had seen corporate power plays before, had witnessed the sudden shift when someone realized they had picked a fight they couldn't win. But the complete collapse of Victoria Palmer's arrogance was something else entirely. It was the look of someone who had just seen their career, their identity, their entire future vaporize in the span of a single phone call. The man on the other end of the phone was Jonathan Thomas. To the world, Jonathan Thomas was a titan. He was the founder and CEO of Quantum Nexus Technologies, a tech conglomerate that had its hands in everything from satellite communications to AI development and private aerospace ventures. He was a regular on the covers of Forbes and Wired, a self-made billionaire who had built an empire from a garage in Boston. His name was synonymous with innovation, disruption, and immense world-altering power. He was a man who could get the President of the United States on the phone in under a minute. An airline CEO was a small fry. When Jade called, he had been in a late-night board meeting in New York, finalizing the details of a multi-billion-dollar acquisition. His phone, which was usually silenced and handled by an assistant, was on the table in front of him, set to a special mode where only one number could get through his daughters. When it rang, he paused the meeting mid-sentence, held up a hand to his board of directors, and answered immediately. "Jade, is everything okay?" He listened, his expression hardening from paternal concern to icy fury as she recounted Victoria's accusations. He heard the forced calm in his daughter's voice and knew she was handling it with the grace he'd taught her. But the thought of anyone, anywhere threatening and humiliating his child made his blood run cold. When Victoria Palmer took the phone, her arrogant, self-important tone was like gasoline on a fire. "This is Victoria Palmer, Senior Flight Purser." "To whom am I speaking?" Jonathan's voice was quiet, almost gentle, but it carried the chilling weight of absolute authority. "Ms. Palmer, this is Jonathan Thomas. I believe you are on a plane that is currently using Quantum Nexus satellite hardware for its Wi-Fi and navigation systems, which my company owns. You are also on a plane whose engine turbines contain patented alloy components, which my company also manufactures. And you are at this moment threatening my daughter." Silence. He let the words hang in the air, allowing the full implication to sink in. "You have made a grave error in judgment. Miss Palmer?" He continued, his voice dropping even lower, colder. "You are not fit to serve the public, let alone wear a uniform that represents customer service. Your career with Transatlantic is over. That is not a threat. It is a statement of fact that will be executed in the next 5 minutes. Now give the phone back to my daughter." While Victoria was stammering her apologies, Jonathan was already texting his chief of staff. The instructions were simple and brutal. Call Robert Ellison, CEO of Transatlantic Airways. Now. Tell him flight TA-847 has a problem. My daughter is being harassed by a flight attendant named Victoria Palmer. By the plane. His chief of staff, a woman accustomed to strange and powerful requests, didn't question the last 3 words. She just acted. On board TA-847, chaos was beginning to ripple outward from seat 2A. Victoria stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the name Jonathan Thomas. She knew it. Everyone knew it. It was like hearing God introduce himself over the phone. Jade took her phone back. "Dad." "Yes, I'm okay. Okay, I will. Love you too." She hung up and looked at Victoria, who was now staring at her with wide, terrified eyes. "You should probably go back to the galley now," Jade said, her voice devoid of triumph or malice. It was a simple, factual statement. Around them, the atmosphere in the cabin had changed completely. Judge Williams was watching with the expression of someone who had just witnessed a textbook example of consequences in action. Dr. Fraser had returned to her documentation, now recording this pivotal interaction with clinical precision. Diego Hernandez sat back in his seat, eyebrows raised, processing what he had just witnessed. And Nicole Parker was filming discreetly on her phone, recognizing a viral moment when she saw one. Before Victoria could move, the chime for the in-flight phone rang in the galley. A moment later, a flustered Michael approached the cockpit door and knocked. It opened, and the co-pilot leaned out. After a brief, hushed exchange, the co-pilot disappeared back inside. A minute later, the cockpit door opened again. This time, it was Captain Robert Wilson himself. He was a tall, authoritative man with silvering hair at his temples and a calm demeanor that had been cultivated over 30 years of flying. But right now, his face was a mask of bewilderment and immense stress. He walked directly into the first-class cabin, his eyes scanning the passengers until they landed on Jade. He walked over, ignoring the still paralyzed Victoria completely. "Miss Thomas," he asked, his voice full of a respect that had been absent moments before. "I'm Captain Wilson. I've just received an unprecedented call from our corporate headquarters. I need to confirm that I am speaking to the daughter of Jonathan Thomas of Quantum Nexus Technologies." Jade simply nodded. "I am." The captain took a deep breath, the full, earth-shattering reality of the situation crashing down on him, his crew, and his flight. "I see. Well, Miss Thomas, on behalf of Transatlantic Airways, I need to offer you my most sincere and profound apologies for the treatment you have received from a member of my crew." He shot a look at Victoria that could have melted steel. "This is an unforgivable lapse in professionalism." He then looked around at the bewildered first-class passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? There has been a change in our flight status." He paused as if struggling to find the right words for a scenario that had never existed before. As of 2 minutes ago, he announced, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. "This aircraft, Transatlantic Flight 847, is no longer a commercial flight. It has been chartered privately for the remainder of the journey to Geneva. This plane is now operating as a private jet for Miss Jade Thomas." The captain's announcement hung in the air, thick and unbelievable. A commercial transatlantic flight mid-air suddenly turned into a private charter. It was impossible. It was absurd. It was something out of a movie. Diego Hernandez, the tech executive in 2D, let out a low whistle. He'd negotiated hostile takeovers, bought and sold companies worth billions, but he had never in his entire life heard of someone buying a plane out from under its passengers while it was in the air. The sheer audacity, the raw, unapologetic display of power was breathtaking. He looked at Jade not just with respect, but with a kind of awe. She wasn't just some rich kid. She was the heir to an empire, and he had just witnessed the empire strike back. The Swiss couple looked utterly baffled, whispering to each other in rapid German. Dr. Fraser and Judge Williams exchanged a glance that contained volumes. The other passengers just stared, their minds trying to compute what they had just heard. Victoria Palmer finally seemed to unfreeze, but only to crumble. The blood drained from her face, leaving a pasty, terrified mask. She understood. Jonathan Thomas hadn't just complained to the CEO. He hadn't just threatened a lawsuit. He had performed a corporate power move so extreme it bordered on the surreal. To protect his daughter from a flight attendant, he had effectively bought the entire flight. He had made the aircraft Jade's private domain. "Is this even legal?" someone whispered from a few rows back. "With enough money, what isn't?" came the reply. Nicole Parker, still recording discreetly, was mentally calculating the social media potential of what she was witnessing. This was beyond viral. This was the stuff of internet legend. A black teenager being harassed by a flight attendant only for her billionaire father to buy the entire plane in response. It was a story made for the digital age, a perfect encapsulation of both racial prejudice and the extraordinary power of wealth to alter reality. Captain Wilson wasn't finished. He turned his gaze directly to Jade. "Miss Thomas," he said, his voice now deferential, "as the sole charterer of this flight, you are now our client. The aircraft and its crew are at your disposal. Our flight plan remains the same for Geneva unless you instruct otherwise. However, all in-flight decisions are now yours to make." He paused, letting the weight of his next words fall squarely on Victoria, specifically regarding the crew. This was the moment. All the power in the cabin had coalesced around seat 2A. Every passenger, the captain, and the terrified flight attendants all looked at the 17-year-old girl in the high school hoodie. Jade looked up at the captain. Then her eyes moved to Michael Taylor, who looked mortified and sympathetic. Finally, her gaze settled on Victoria Palmer. For the first time, Jade saw past the arrogant bully. She saw a woman who was utterly broken, whose life had just been dismantled in a matter of minutes because of her own ugliness. There was no pleasure in it. There was no victory lap. There was only a grim sense of justice and a profound sadness that it had come to this. She spoke, her voice quiet, but carrying the authority that had been thrust upon her. "Captain," she began, "thank you. My only instruction is that we continue to Geneva as planned. All the other passengers are your guests, and they should continue to receive the highest level of service." She then looked at Michael. "Michael, you've been professional and kind. I would like you to be the purser for the remainder of this flight. You're in charge of the cabin." Michael's eyes widened. A field promotion mid-flight on the orders of the new owner. He could only nod, speechless. "Yes, Miss Thomas. Thank you." Finally, Jade turned her attention to the ghost-white Victoria. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gloat. She delivered the final verdict with the dispassionate precision of a surgeon. "Victoria," she said, using her first name for the first time, "your behavior was not just unprofessional. It was cruel. You judged me based on my age and the color of my skin. You tried to humiliate me. You abused your authority." She took a breath. "You are relieved of your duties effective immediately. You will go to the crew rest area and you will remain there until we land. You will not speak to me or any other passenger again." She paused, letting the sentence hang in the air before delivering the final blow. "My father has already spoken to your CEO. When we land in Geneva, you will be met by a transatlantic corporate representative. You should pack your belongings from your layover accommodation. You are fired." The words spoken so calmly were more devastating than any scream could have been. It was an execution delivered without emotion. Victoria Palmer made a small choking sound. Her carefully constructed world, her 22 years of seniority, her very identity. It had all been incinerated in the span of 5 minutes. She stumbled backward, bumping into a bulkhead, her face a grotesque canvas of shock and despair. "This can't be happening," she whispered more to herself than anyone else. "There must be some mistake. I was just doing my job. You were harassing a passenger based on prejudice?" Judge Williams said, his voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench. That is not your job, Ms. Palmer, and I suspect if we interviewed other passengers of color who have flown with you, we would find this is not an isolated incident." Victoria's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide with fear at this new threat. The idea that her past behavior might be scrutinized, that this might not be seen as a one-time lapse in judgment but as part of a pattern, seemed to terrify her even more than the loss of her job. Two other flight attendants who had been watching from the galley quickly and gently escorted her away, not out of sympathy but to remove the embarrassing spectacle from the cabin. As she disappeared behind the curtain, a strange quiet settled over the first-class cabin. It was the quiet of a storm that had passed, leaving behind a completely new landscape. Jade Thomas looked out her window at the endless dark sky, the owner of a jet, feeling not the triumph one might expect, but the heavy weight of a power she never wanted to use. "Are you all right?" Dr. Fraser asked quietly from the seat behind her. Jade turned, surprised by the question. "Yes, I think so. It's just a lot." "You handled it with remarkable composure," Fraser said. "I've seen physicians twice your age respond to conflict with far less grace." "I've had practice," Jade replied with a small, rueful smile, though never quite at this scale. "Well, if medicine doesn't work out for you," Fraser said with gentle humor, "you have a promising future in crisis management." The comment broke some of the tension, earning a genuine laugh from Jade. Around the cabin, other passengers seemed to relax slightly as well, the atmosphere shifting from shock to something approaching normalcy, albeit a new normal where a teenager had just fired a flight attendant mid-flight after her father purchased the plane. As Michael began organizing the cabin service with his newfound authority, passengers started discussing what they had witnessed in hushed tones. The Swiss couple kept glancing at Jade with a mixture of awe and confusion. Nicole Parker was typing furiously on her phone, presumably sharing her first-hand account with friends or colleagues. Jade found herself the center of attention in a way she had never experienced before. It was uncomfortable, this sudden transformation from someone Victoria had tried to make invisible to someone everyone was hyper-aware of. She retreated into her quantum computing book, seeking the familiar comfort of equations and theories that made sense, that followed logical rules, unlike human behavior. But her mind kept returning to Victoria Palmer's face in that final moment, the devastating realization that she had destroyed her own career through prejudice and poor judgment. There was no satisfaction in that image, only a solemn recognition of consequences justly applied. And as the flight continued toward Geneva, with Michael now overseeing an impeccably attentive cabin service, Jade couldn't help but reflect on the extraordinary power her father wielded, power that had for a moment extended to her. It was a sobering realization, carrying with it a weight of responsibility she was only beginning to comprehend. The quiet that followed Victoria's departure was thick with a peculiar tension, not the hostility of before, but a stunned awareness that the passengers had just witnessed something extraordinary. It was the silence of people trying to process a scenario that fell outside all normal parameters of air travel. Michael Taylor, newly promoted to purser, was the first to break it. He approached Jade's seat with a glass of water. "Miss Thomas," he said, his voice pitched low. "For privacy, is there anything else I can do for you?" Jade looked up at him. She saw the concern in his eyes, the genuine desire to make things right. "My seat," she said. "It's still not fully reclining." "Of course. Let me fix that for you right away." As Michael knelt to address the seat mechanism, Dr. Fraser leaned forward. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked softly. Jade turned to the older woman, recognizing the concern in her voice. "I'm fine, thank you. Just a bit overwhelmed." Dr. Fraser nodded. "Understandable. That was quite a situation. You handled it with remarkable composure." "I didn't want to create a scene," Jade admitted. "I just wanted to be treated like everyone else. Sometimes standing up for that basic dignity creates a scene," Dr. Fraser said. "It's not your responsibility to make prejudice comfortable." From across the aisle, Diego Hernandez spoke up. Your father's response was impressive. Jade couldn't help a small smile. Dad doesn't believe in half measures. Clearly, Diego replied, his tone caught between admiration and disbelief. I've been in tech for 15 years. Your father is a legend. The Quantum Nexus satellite network revolutionized global communications. He started coding in our basement. Jade said, a note of pride creeping into her voice. Mom used to bring him sandwiches because he'd forget to eat. The simple humanizing detail seemed to break some of the tension. Several passengers smiled. Judge Williams, who had been silently observing, finally spoke. Young lady, what you experienced today happens far too often, though rarely with such dramatic resolution. I hope you know that Victoria's behavior reflects only on her, not on you. Jade nodded. Thank you, sir. Michael stood up, having fixed the seat. There you go, Miss Thomas. It should recline fully now. Thank you, Michael. And please just call me Jade. As Michael moved away to attend to other passengers, Jade's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from her father. Everything okay now? Do you need anything else? She typed back. I'm fine, Dad. Thanks for the quick response. But did you really need to buy the plane? His reply came instantly. Technically, I only chartered it. Though by now, Nicole might have acquired a controlling interest in transatlantic. She gets enthusiastic. Jade shook her head, smiling despite herself. Nicole Reyes was her father's chief of staff, a brilliant former Wall Street executive with a reputation for executing Jonathan Thomas's directives with terrifying efficiency. You're unbelievable, she texted back. Love you too, sweetheart. Call me when you land. A follow-up text came through. And Jade, I'm proud of you for standing your ground. That takes courage. This last message brought unexpected tears to Jade's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, not wanting to draw more attention to herself. Her father's approval had always mattered to her, but in this moment, knowing that he recognized the strength it had taken to face Victoria's prejudice head-on before calling him, it meant everything. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Wilson was on a secure line with Transatlantic's CEO, Robert Ellison. The conversation was one-sided, with the captain mostly listening and occasionally saying, "Yes, sir," and "Understood, sir." When he returned to the cabin, his composed demeanor had been restored, though there was a new tightness around his eyes. "Miss Thomas," he said, approaching Jade's seat. "I've been instructed to inform you that a corporate representative will be meeting our flight in Geneva to personally address today's incident. Mr. Ellison, our CEO, has asked me to convey his deepest personal apologies." "Thank you," Captain Jade replied. "I appreciate that. I hope you understand that my issue was specifically with Ms. Palmer's behavior, not with Transatlantic as a whole." "That's very gracious of you," the captain said, relief evident in his voice. "If there's anything else you need during the remainder of our flight, please don't hesitate to ask." As he returned to the cockpit, Diego leaned across the aisle again. "So," he said with a wry smile, "what's it like to own a plane at 17? Jade laughed, a genuine sound that helped dissipate the last of the tension. "Technically, my dad's the one who owns it, or chartered it, or whatever just happened." Still, Diego said, that has to be the most dramatic response to poor customer service in aviation history. "My dad is protective," Jade said, searching for the right word. "He doesn't tolerate people being mistreated, especially his family." "With good reason," Dr. Fraser interjected. "What that woman did was completely unacceptable." "Indeed," Nicole Parker added, joining the conversation from across the aisle. "I've faced my share of prejudice in corporate settings, but what she did was blatant and ugly. You know," Judge Williams said thoughtfully, "there's something instructive in what we witnessed tonight. Most instances of prejudice go unchecked because the target lacks the power to force accountability." "Exactly," Diego agreed. I've been in situations where I was clearly being treated differently because of my accent or my name. But I didn't have a billionaire father to call, which raises uncomfortable questions about justice. Williams continued, "Should accountability for prejudice depend on the target's access to power?" "Of course not," Dr. Fraser said firmly. "But in the absence of institutional safeguards, sometimes individual power is the only recourse. That's what my dad always says," Jade offered. "He believes in changing systems, not just punishing individuals, but he also says that sometimes you need to do both." As the conversation continued, Jade was struck by how quickly she had been accepted by these accomplished adults. An hour ago, she had been isolated, targeted, made to feel like an intruder. Now she was at the center of a thoughtful discussion about power, prejudice, and accountability. The transformation was dizzying. But even as she engaged with her fellow passengers, part of her mind wandered to Victoria Palmer, now confined to the crew rest area. What was going through her mind? Regret, anger, fear for her future. It was strange to think that a woman who had held such power over her comfort and dignity just hours ago was now effectively her employee, waiting in isolation for the consequences of her actions. The thought wasn't satisfying. It was sobering. Power could shift in an instant, but what mattered was how it was wielded. Her father had taught her that too. Meanwhile, on the ground, Nicole Reyes was orchestrating a corporate response that would be studied in business schools for years to come. Jonathan Thomas's initial directive. Buy the plane had been slightly modified in execution. Instead of literally purchasing the aircraft, Quantum Nexus had acquired enough shares in Transatlantic Airways to demand immediate action. Robert Ellison, Transatlantic's CEO, had been pulled from a dinner with investors in London to deal with the crisis. When told that Jonathan Thomas's daughter had been harassed by one of his flight attendants, he had gone pale. Quantum Nexus not only provided critical communications technology to Transatlantic, but was also considering the airline for an exclusive corporate travel contract worth hundreds of millions. Within minutes, he had issued directives that transformed TA-847 into a private charter, effectively giving Jade Thomas complete authority over the aircraft. Victoria Palmer's termination was approved without question, and plans were made for damage control on a massive scale. By the time Jade's flight was halfway to Geneva, the incident had already become a case study in how quickly corporate priorities could shift when a powerful client was wronged. But in seat 2A, Jade Thomas wasn't thinking about corporate machinations or power plays. She was thinking about her presentation tomorrow, about the equations in her book, and about how to navigate a world where her identity would always be a complex equation of its own, one that included not just her race and gender, but also the immense privilege of her family name. She wasn't naive. She understood that without her father's intervention, Victoria's behavior might have gone unchecked. The flight attendant might have continued harassing her, might even have had security waiting in Geneva. Her word against Victoria's with institutional power aligned against her. That realization was uncomfortable. Not because she regretted calling her father Victoria had crossed a line that demanded response, but because she knew that countless others faced similar prejudice without recourse, without a powerful advocate, without the ability to demand accountability. "Penny for your thoughts," Judge Williams asked gently, noticing her pensive expression. "I was just thinking about how different this might have played out if I didn't have my dad to call," Jade admitted. The judge nodded understanding immediately. "That's the burden of privilege, isn't it? Recognizing that the justice you received is often denied to others." "So what do you do with that recognition?" she asked. That Williams said with a small smile is the question that has defined my entire career, and I suspect it's one you'll be wrestling with long after this flight is forgotten. As the plane continued its journey across the Atlantic, carrying its unusual mix of passengers toward Geneva, Jade found herself in a strange new reality. The flight attendants now approached her with a deference that bordered on reverence. Fellow passengers regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. And somewhere in the crew rest area, Victoria Palmer sat alone contemplating the ruins of her career. In the cockpit, Captain Wilson was receiving real-time updates from Transatlantic's corporate headquarters. The company was in crisis mode, executives being pulled from their beds in the middle of the night to address what was rapidly becoming both a PR emergency and a potential legal nightmare. The stakes had escalated dramatically when they learned that Judge Williams was on board and had witnessed the entire incident. Back in New York, Jonathan Thomas had returned to his board meeting after ensuring his daughter's safety. When questioned about the brief interruption, he simply said, "A situation required my attention." It's been handled. His board members, accustomed to his decisive management style, asked no further questions. But news of what had happened was already beginning to spread through certain circles, carried by text messages from Nicole Parker and other passengers with connections in the business world. By the time Flight 847 began its descent toward Geneva, hashtags related to the incident were trending on social media platforms. Hashtag First Class. While Black and hashtag Billionaire Dad Justice were gathering thousands of posts per hour, fueled by Nicole Parker's cryptic but tantalizing posts about witnessing corporate karma in real time at 37,000 feet. For Jade, however, the remainder of the flight was surprisingly tranquil. After the confrontation with Victoria, she had finally been able to recline her seat fully thanks to Michael's adjustments. She had managed to get a few hours of sleep, preparing herself for the competition ahead. When she woke, the cabin was quiet, most passengers either sleeping or working quietly on their devices. She found Judge Williams awake, reading a legal brief by the soft glow of his seat light. "How are you feeling?" he asked, noticing her stirring. "Better," she replied. "More rested." "Good. You have a big day ahead from what I understand. Some kind of scientific competition?" Jade nodded. "An international STEM challenge. My team developed an algorithm for quantum computing applications in medical research." "Impressive." Williams said genuine admiration in his voice. "You know, my wife would have loved to discuss that with you. She was always excited about young women entering scientific fields." "Was she a scientist herself?" "A physicist. Quantum coherence was her specialty. She passed away 5 years ago, but her work continues through her students." "I'm sorry for your loss," Jade said softly. "Thank you. She lived fully and left her mark on the world. That's all any of us can hope for." He regarded Jade thoughtfully. "You're on your way to doing the same, I think. Not just because of your scientific work, though, that's certainly important, but also because of how you carry yourself in moments like what happened today." "I just did what seemed right," Jade replied, uncomfortable with the praise. "That's precisely my point. Your instinct was to stand your ground with dignity, not to lash out or cower. That's a rare quality at any age, but especially at 17. Their conversation was interrupted by the captain's announcement that they were beginning their descent into Geneva. The cabin lights brightened gradually, and flight attendants moved through the cabin, ensuring that seats were upright and tray tables stowed. Michael approached Jade's seat, his manner professional but friendly. "We'll be landing in about 20 minutes. Jade," he said. "Is there anything you need before we begin our descent?" "No, thank you, Michael. Everything's fine." He hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "I just wanted to say, what happened earlier? It wasn't right. I should have intervened sooner." "You tried," Jade said. "I saw that." "Not hard enough," he replied, regret evident in his tone. "Sometimes it's difficult to challenge a superior even when they're clearly wrong, but that's no excuse. We all have moments when we wish we'd done more," Judge Williams interjected gently. "The important thing is learning from them." Michael nodded gratefully. "I certainly have, and I'll be making some changes in how I handle similar situations in the future." As Michael moved away to prepare the cabin for landing, Dr. Fraser leaned forward from her seat. You know, she said to Jade, your father's dramatic response will likely overshadow everything else about this incident in the public eye. People love stories about the wealthy exercising power in unexpected ways. But I hope you understand that what matters most is how you handled yourself before that call with dignity and restraint, despite provocation. I agree, Diego added from across the aisle. The phone call made for good theater, but your composure throughout was the real victory. Jade appreciated their perspectives, especially since they had witnessed the entire incident firsthand. But part of her still felt uncomfortable with the outcome, not because Victoria didn't deserve consequences, but because the power dynamic that had enabled those consequences was itself problematic. As the aircraft touched down on the Geneva runway, Jade found herself wondering how this experience would affect her moving forward. Would it change how she saw herself, how others saw her? Would it make her more cautious about how she presented herself in public, or more confident in asserting her right to be wherever she chose to be? These questions would have to wait. For now, she needed to focus on the competition ahead, on presenting her team's research with the clarity and confidence it deserved. Whatever ripples had been created by the incident on Flight 847, she was determined not to let them distract from the work that had brought her to Geneva in the first place. But as the aircraft taxied toward the terminal, she couldn't help but notice the unusual reception awaiting them, a group of officials in suits standing at attention on the tarmac. Apparently, news of what had transpired at 37,000 feet had preceded their arrival, and the corporate response was already in motion. What Jade didn't yet realize was how dramatically her life was about to change, not just because of her father's intervention, but because of how her own response to prejudice would resonate far beyond the confines of transatlantic Flight 847. The story of Jade Thomas and Victoria Palmer didn't end with a neat resolution or a perfect friendship. Life rarely offers such simple conclusions. Instead, it evolved into something more nuanced, a complex interweaving of consequences, growth, and unexpected connections. For Jade, the incident became a footnote in an increasingly impressive biography. Her team won the Gables Young Innovator Award, providing funding that accelerated their research significantly. By the end of her freshman year, she had co-authored 2 papers published in prestigious scientific journals. Her summer internship at Novartis transformed into an ongoing research position that she balanced with her studies. More importantly, Jade found her voice as both a scientist and an advocate. She spoke at schools in underserved communities, launched a mentoring program for young women of color interested in STEM fields, and advised companies on creating more inclusive environments. Her experience had given her a platform, and she used it thoughtfully to effect meaningful change. Transatlantic Airways underwent its own transformation. The training program developed with Victoria and Judge Williams was implemented company-wide, then adopted by other airlines and service industries. Robert Ellison, the CEO, made diversity and inclusion core components of the corporate culture rather than peripheral considerations. The changes weren't perfect, and progress wasn't always linear, but the commitment was genuine and sustained. As for Victoria Palmer, she never returned to the skies, but she found a new purpose in her work with Judge Williams's foundation. The training program they developed together reached thousands of customer service professionals, creating ripples of change throughout multiple industries. She lived more modestly than before, but with greater awareness and authenticity. What began as a moment of prejudice and confrontation had transformed into a catalyst for growth and change, not just for the individuals directly involved, but for the systems and institutions around them. It was a reminder that even our worst moments can become opportunities for transformation if we approach them with honesty, courage, and a willingness to learn. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives about overcoming prejudice, finding your voice, and creating positive change in the world. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that dignity isn't negotiable, and that standing your ground with grace is one of the most powerful tools we have against discrimination. Remember, it's not about having a billionaire father. It's about recognizing your own worth and refusing to let others define you by their limited perceptions.